your time more carefully.
Yeah.
Apparently we're all very collectively bad at clapping, so...
I'm writing a list.
Okay, great. Okay, cool. Then you guys all ready? Guys, you can just quickly make sure your phone's on silent. That would be great. Any questions before we get started? Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Let's welcome the Prime Minister to begin the debate. And just before he does that, let's quickly do gender pronouns. So I'm Colin, I'm he, I'll be the chair.
I'm Rob. Call me Rob.
I'm Leo, and my third pronoun is he.
James, Kate.
Katie, she.
Luke, he. Matt, Paul, he, there's also fine.
And I go Shirley.
Joking, please.
Dora, she. Bronte, I believe they them pronouns.
Thanks, guys. Sorry, PM, back up for you.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, it's very necessary to characterise what we're speaking about today. We're speaking about states that have continuously oppressed racial and ethnic minorities throughout their existence. We're talking about governments that have been participants in genocides. We're talking about governments that have overseen the mass murder of black African Americans at the hands of the state police. What we want to say to you today from opening government is that for too long, states have been able to essentialise race as a core component of people's identity and actively discriminate against them in order to dictate to them their destiny and the way in which they live their lives. We're going to bring you a few points today at opening government. I'm going to speak about why the government is inherently a bad actor when it comes to issues of race, why the government has no right to the information of your race or racial identity. Then we're going to talk about how the provision of social services is completely skewed when a government has access to your racial or ethnic details, and how that is inherently harmful to people who are racially or ethnic minorities in their society. Now, firstly, why the government is a bad actor? Yeah, I'll take you now.
So does this mean you wouldn't inform the public of how many immigrants are let into their country, for example?
What we think is that the necessary component is like how many, we can say like immigrants are coming, but we wouldn't necessarily say that, you know, X amount of Muslim people are coming in or Y amount of other ethnic minority coming in. But what the issue is here is that why is the government a bad actor? And as I prefaced in my opening, it's because governments throughout history have been participants in the discrimination against racial or ethnic minorities, whether it be the stolen generation in Australia, whether it be slavery in America, or more recently the social housing discrimination that has been rife and completely deprived African American people of a chance of a good life. We think that because of this issue, it's essentially extremely harmful for these governments to have this information, because oftentimes these governments are filled with a homogenous racial majority. They have no way to actively identify and clarify with those racial minorities the needs and wants of their community. Because of this fact, when they have this information, they're more likely to commit bad choices on a public policy level. They're more likely to generalise the needs and wants of these communities. Because of that fact, it is vital, it is essential that governments don't have this information. On to my second point, and that's why the government has no right to this information and why defining people by their race is inherently harmful. People often have a very different conception of what their racial, ethnic, or religious identity is. Someone who might identify as a Muslim mightn't necessarily want to be characterised as a Muslim. Someone who is African American mightn't necessarily want to be known as an African American. Some may want to do so. But when you do this, and when you essentialise this racial identity, it allows people to be put in a box, and it doesn't allow them to self-actualise on the level necessary to ensure that they are able to further their own individual interests. Because of this, the government then has the capacity to put people in this box, as I was speaking about. They have the capacity to generalise the kind of life experiences that these people may have generally had. Because of that, it allows people to be oppressed, and it doesn't allow them to be able to ensure the issues that confront them in their daily lives are actually properly addressed. I'll take one from closing if they've got one.
Yeah, so if I apply now to a state institution for a job, am I no longer able to express what race I am or anything like that?
Well, I don't think that when you apply for a job at a government level, that you should be stopped from actually saying what your race is. But I don't think that the government should be able to ask you what your race is and what racial grouping that you identify as. As I said, some people may choose to identify on a personal level as being part of a particular racial or ethnic grouping. However, when you essentialise this component, that is when discrimination takes place. Some people may be more than willing to identify as an African American or a Muslim or an Indigenous Australian. However, when they are made to identify, and when the government takes down this listing of their racial identity, you actively discriminate against them, and you make the chances for discrimination throughout their lives infinitely greater. Now on to the issues that I wanted to talk about with regards to government services. Now, one particular example that is particularly pertinent in this case is the issue of Robert Caro, who was the most powerful man in New York for a substantial period of time. He was a city planner who was effectively able to disenfranchise a massive amount of African American people because he had access to their racial identity and the information pertaining to their racial identity. What he did was able to create a sect of social housing that effectively put these people out of sight and out of mind. Not only that, he built bridges that were too low for buses to be able to pass under them, so that they couldn't access the essential amenities that were necessary for them to actually progress as people in American society. But this isn't where it stops, right? Because back in Australia, for example, the prevalence of racial identity has been able to be used in order to disenfranchise the Indigenous communities, right? In Australia, the Northern Territory intervention meant that the army was put on the ground to confiscate people's property rights to ensure that they didn't have access to things like money, so that they were given cash cards and told what they could buy. The person that instituted this policy was the Prime Minister called John Howard, who denies that a genocide ever occurred against Indigenous Australians. That's what we're talking about in this debate. We're talking about the state that is generally filled with white, middle-aged men who have no conception of what it is to be a racial minority. Now, why does the deprivation of the state's right to information as to regards to your racial information allow racial minorities, when they choose to identify as racial minorities, to collectively organise on a much more efficient level? It's because these governments no longer can characterise you as one homogenous group that doesn't have disparate interests and different ideas. When a group of racially identifying people or ethnically identifying people are able to band together and not be treated as a statistic, they are much more able to self-actualise their destiny, their political ideals, and actually tell the government what they want, rather than the government using a statistic book to effectively dictate to them what their life choices should be and what services they are entitled to. Because we've told you that for so long the state has oppressed these racial minorities, because race doesn't necessarily have to be an essential component of your identity, but also when it does become an essential component of your identity, you are much able to more effectively organise under this model. We're so proud to propose. Oh, we're good here. Sorry. We find it really heartwarming that Proposition can afford at this point in history to be colourblind.
given all of the oppression that they've described and all of the different stages of development that ethnic minorities have been forced to go through compared to their oppressive majorities. We think because of the specific abuses that they described in Prime Minister, that is why we need the information now to actually correct for those. That's why we see policies such as affirmative action seeking to right those wrongs. That's why we see things like reparations being paid to those who were wronged in the past. We need accurate information for all those things to happen, not just whatever like the tabloids tell us is true of immigrants or true of people who don't have the same colour skin as us. Two things in this speech. First of all, we're going to look at state services, how we need accurate information in order for those wrongs to be righted. And secondly, we're going to look at public opinion of minorities and how that's shaped by this proposition. First of all, three things that don't quite fit in. We're told about government oppression at length by the Prime Minister. Like in another example, we'd look at Chicago's social housing situation in the 1960s, where black individuals were actually not allowed to get mortgages. They were instead set up on individual contracts that meant that if they missed one single repayment, they were kicked out of that house and then moved to the south of America. What that did then was it set up those individuals on an entirely different track of development from the rest of the country. It meant that they were always going to be poorer than their white counterparts. What that means now with this proposition is that we freeze our ability as a government to actively deconstruct that structural oppression. No thank you. So we can't actually provide specific policies that will be both accurate and effective to allow those individuals to get back onto the economic ladder and actually no thank you, right themselves in that fashion. Secondly, we're told that individuals will be essentialised by having to fill out these polls because you necessarily have to tick a box. We would point out that first of all, like these individuals are ticking the boxes themselves, so they are telling you what they perceive themselves, no thank you, to be. They are also entitled to not answer that question. There is always a box that says, and if there isn't, we'll include it, no thank you, that says, like, I don't identify with any of the groups you've identified, or I'd rather not answer. Like, all of those things mean that no thank you, wait 15 seconds, that you don't have to say those things. It's not funny. And the second issue within this, though, is that the reason that we specifically need governments to be giving us this information in order to avoid the essentialisation that we're talking about in first prop is that we need all of that information. So it isn't just race that prevents you from getting a job, it's also other factors that go into that. However, it is only the government that has sufficient resources, no thank you, that mean you have enough resources to gather information on both race, no thank you, geographical location, income, all of those factors that make it harder for an individual to actually get on that ladder. It is only the government that can provide that. Finally, we're told, oh, well, the government will continue to do terrible things like in the 1960s, like we point out, it's the 21st century, but like in the 1960s, no thank you, because they're all white men and they're all homogenous groups. First of all, we would say that local government is a thing, so a huge amount of devolved power exists around the world where local governments are far more representative, and even if they're not, they're far more aware of the issues within those communities because they're the ones who elect them, because often it is municipal governments that actually have control of the most important services to individuals' daily lives, such as social housing. Secondly, we would also say that these governments are demonstrably not all homogenous groups, insofar as we often have quotas in place already that means that there is sufficient representation within those parliaments. Thirdly, we would say that insofar as people want to screw others over and want to use misinformation, they get it on either side of the house because they're not going to trust a government source anyway, because they want to use the thing that is most advantageous for their side. So they're going to use that tabloid poll that says that the country is overrun with immigrants or whatever to try and screw them over. Importantly, what we do is we let individuals, no thank you, self-identify and say what it is that is important to them, rather than this huge amount of misinformation that will exist under this proposition, because other polls will still be able to be carried out. First of all, state services. So how do we ever know that these problems exist? Because it is easy, I will take you in a minute, for us to say now that, well, maybe these problems don't exist. We don't have any real data that says that individuals who are African American are actually discriminated against on a regular basis, because there's no official government source that tells me that. All it is a biased, like, Guardian or New York Times article that told me that. It's not a paper I believe in, so why should I trust that? We think governments literally need to know what those problems are in order for them to be able to fix it. An example of this is in New Zealand, where jails are actually set up around Maori culture now in the areas that matter, so people feel like they're not just being tossed into a white prison cell and being left there to rot. Go ahead.
How do you secure the accuracy of the information if you're allowing people to opt out of this being their ethnicity?
Right, so statisticians are very smart people. They're able to understand that there are certain rates of opt-out that apply potentially more within individuals. That's why we're able to actually plan very well for social services with censuses, even though we know that, for example, illegal migrants may not fill out those censuses, even though, for example, people who feel oppressed may not fill them out to the same degree as other people in those countries. We're still able to plan our social services quite well. Additionally, within this, though, it's not even just that the state is able to provide services for those individuals. It's also for the individuals themselves to be able to positively identify with that state, because it is not good enough for a state to just say that in the absence of racism that we are doing a good job for minorities. A state, no thank you, should also be a place where minorities can celebrate both themselves and be celebrated by others. That thing can only happen when there is accurate state supporting of services that are channeled towards minorities who need it most. So whether it's with effective affirmative action, whether it's with effective types of education or schooling or whatever it may be. That is how individuals see that they have a positive contribution to make. It's how they see that they belong, and you don't get these separations of society that would happen under proposition. No thank you. Let's look secondly at public opinion, because we think a huge amount of the time the public is massively misinformed about the amounts of people in their country, maybe from other places in the world, or even the amounts of ethnic minorities in their own country. That is because those who are either tacitly or explicitly racist tend to have a fear of people who they see as being different from them. We need real government information that says actually it isn't that half of America is black right now, or it isn't that Germany is being overrun with migrants. It's actually these are the numbers, and they're comparatively quite small when you spread that out across an entire nation. What that does is it actually makes it easier for an individual who isn't a horrible person to say, okay, maybe we actually could afford to provide more welfare in these instances, or maybe we could afford to have a specific job schemes that help out other individuals. That is better, obviously, because those individuals get those services, but also because they don't face the subtle or explicit racism, the same amount of subtle or explicit racism on the streets because of the government real information that has been that has been provided. Look, our case is very simple. Under their side, bad opinion polls and other things will still exist. So that means that there will still be scaremongering, and that is the only information available to people. We cannot afford as a government to just tell ourselves that we are now colourblind when there are very serious issues that still affect people of colour in pretty much every nation in the world. For those reasons, this proposition cannot stand. We oppose.
What the opposition never engaged with was the fact that governments weren't all good actors that had racial quotas within their parliament, and the majority of governments in the world don't actually have those kind of amazing things we probably would like to see. What they conveniently liked to avoid was that governments were made up of white individuals who make terrible policy for the people who they govern over, for their minority groups. And we've seen this time and time again. We gave you the example of the Northern Territory intervention in Luke's speech. We'll tell you about how Native populations are treated in America as well. There are a million examples all over the world. And that doesn't just stop in Western liberal democracies, because all the harms we told you exemplify greatly when you think about places like Turkey and Kurdish minority groups there, when the government literally wants to kill them. That's why it's particularly problematic, because they were never able to prove or engage with why the government was a good actor rather than just asserting it. We think because you're a minority, you don't have considerable political control about who is in charge. Because if you don't like the government, you're the minority. You don't get to outvote the majority of white people in your society. You don't make change. We don't believe that white people are as nice as they'd like to think. We think they're largely quite racist. Okay, no thank you. So firstly, I've got 3 issues in this speech. Firstly, are governments a good actor? Secondly, how will this change people's opinion and influence racism? And thirdly, I'm going to talk about racial profiling, how this will extremify the Islamic community because the government will literally feel like the government is targeting them, how this will be worse for the African American communities when the police can have that information and literally go straight to them. So firstly, on this issue that the government is not a terrible actor in this debate. No, thank you. So what we want to firstly point out, and what I already opened with, is the fact that not all democracies are actually able to get the voices of the minority heard. We think when you've got a policy like this, and when a right, rich, male government thinks that they know what the minorities want because they can point to a number, that is extremely problematic, and you stop the ability for all minority groups within this area to be able to have any kind of political autonomy because the government is able to say exactly what they want. There's no chance for them to actually get involved in that process at all because the government is more able to make conclusions about what they want when they can point to that. But secondly though, and this was really important, it wasn't actually engaged with by the opposition, was the fact that it's not necessarily just your ethnic culture that means the social services that you need. We think it's low socioeconomic people in general who need the kind of services. Even if we accept like a government who is really good and cares about racial minorities, we think that's always going to become at the expense of maybe like a white poor community, which is just as bad off, and that's extremely problematic. We think the way you deal with poverty in society is not by separating groups out and telling them they need different things from your white rich government. It's by dealing with poverty as a whole. We're better able to do this because we don't segregate people. We don't put them into boxes they don't necessarily agree with. No thank you. So we don't think it was necessarily going to stop the provision of services. We think under our side we have a government who is more willing to listen to the people, not to simply gather a statistic on what they look like, which is exactly what this policy looked like. They asked Luke a point of information, was like, would you ask people their racial identity when going for jobs? Probably not, because governments and individuals and corporations are racist as. So we don't think that was ever going to be a good idea. We think it was better when they're able to opt out of that if they ever wanted to be able to get that job against that white person. No, thank you. That was incredibly problematic. We were never going to support a government that made it acceptable for people to demand their racial identity. What Luke told you, and also was ignored, was the fact that people might not necessarily want to put that down. If you don't put that racial identity down, you're not accessing those services the government now only assigns to that specific group. That's particularly problematic, and I'll point to the example of Raven Simone from That's So Raven, who doesn't actually identify as an African American. She identifies as an American, and she has a right to do that, but she also has a right probably to the services if she wasn't so wealthy in that society, and that's not fair that if she wants to access those, the government gets to put her in a box, and the government has been putting, no thank you, her and her culture in a box her whole life. That was never going to be fair. We also think that you're actually able to better target poor communities under our side when you simply don't put them in there just because of their like ethnic cultural status, because we don't think that's always true that black communities are always particularly poor. We think when you're able to actually target low socioeconomic areas, you make the most aggregate difference and not just for one specific culture, because we think in America, for instance, you're more likely to probably target African Americans with like beneficial policy than you are to target maybe an Islamic community in there because of anti-Islamic sentiment. No thank you. That was always going to be problematic because governments weren't able to understand the nuances and the way that different groups felt objectified in society. Then they wanted to tell us that it was really important for things like reparations. If like you don't need to have this policy to get reparations. If your family was divided their land, you could probably just come forth when the government asked you to come forth, and then they can evaluate. That was never necessary to get that kind of thing, and it was never proved why that had to be mutually exclusive. Rather, we think it was better on our side because it gave these individuals the autonomy, because a lot of people whose families suffered through slavery don't want to be defined by that forever. They want to be able to move forward with their lives, and you box them into being that person forever. We gave them the autonomy to not have to do that. That was significantly important. We think we can celebrate racial minorities. We can celebrate them as a whole and not segregating them out by a racist white government. Okay, now I'm going to talk about refugees. So they asked us, wouldn't we tell people the number? Maybe you tell them the amount of people coming in. We probably don't think you should tell them the kind of racial identities of them coming in, because that's what fuels Donald Trump saying that no Muslims should be coming into America anymore. That's considerably problematic because the population as a whole in most societies is quite racist. We've seen the rise of the right in Germany following this as well. We think that is problematic when you're able to segregate these people out. This is when you're able to call for things like Christian refugees coming in only. That's problematic because it literally involves racist policy coming out, and we've seen this happen in America already. But secondly, then they wanted to tell us that racist people wouldn't trust sources that were from non-government actors, from the government. We think they probably wouldn't trust them anyway, even if they're from the government and they didn't agree with them. We think a reasonable person is more likely to trust a source from an independent body that talks about the problem in a way that doesn't have to be specifically numbers. We think racist people are always going to be pissed off under either side. We think under our side, though, you didn't give the government and the individuals exact access to it. No, thank you. Now I'm going to talk about racial profiling. This is a huge problem all over the world and in America. I've already spoken about really bad states like Turkey and how that would impact, but this is how it impacts in Western nations. We think that there's already a problem with police brutality. When the police are able to go there and say that this African American person, they're able to more easily target them. We also think the way that it targets Muslim communities is particularly different. Muslim communities already feel like the government is watching over them. When the government literally makes them tick a box and say that they are of Islamic identity, it means that they're going to feel more observed by their government. They're going to feel untrusted by their government. They're probably going to feel their government is going to start observing them more. We think this is a huge problem in this debate and just in society in general, because we think the way you stop extremism, the way that you make people feel they can integrate into society more, is when you don't feel like the government is controlling their lives. We think they're better able to organise when the government doesn't just tell them what they do, and they don't feel scared to organise because the government literally knows who they are and what their racial identity is. Ladies and gentlemen, because the opposition was going to screw over every minority, and because we were able to provide better services and not let racist governments destroy their ethnic culture and tell them what they had to be, we're proud to propose.
My first point is why governments, in some cases, do need this information. My second is why it helps mould public opinion, which actively affects the lives of each and every citizen for the better. But before I get into that, I do have 4 pieces of rebuttal. So the first, and this is going to be a kind of a tennis thing back and forth, how they say all the bad things governments have done, we say all the good. The first is a helpful caveat, that we just don't have to stand over everything. Their policy is that we should never collect this information. It would be fair of us in this debate to say that we only support it from good governments, but that's boring. So let's go further in saying that the reality is, the problem with their case is that they want to stop governments doing bad things by immobilising them. You take away the information that would allow them to accurately and effectively do anything as a policy to try stop them doing racist things. That is ineffective because it leaves us in an imperfect position where some people have been pushed down. They have suffered from racist past government actions and actions of others up to this day. They don't get to choose to live in a colour-blind world, but they don't get any help from a government that cannot accurately help them, because to the extent that they could accurately hurt them, obviously they could help them. But here's the other thing. All of their examples, all of them, about how a government is able to oppress minorities do not rely on the information that they're getting from censuses. That is crucial. So they give you the example of building a subpar housing policy and forcing individuals of a certain racial minority there. I don't need a census to know how many people exist even to do that. I just take the applicants, and when I see one from that racial minority, I put them in there. Policemen who use brutal tactics on the streets don't see whether someone is African American from going back and checking a census. That's bizarre and a characterization for how governments might need these policies. The reality is that just by living, and specifically since other polls will exist and this information will be out there, governments have all the bad information they need to do bad things. What they don't have, and what we give you in first opposition, is actually asking people in a census, how do you identify? What support structures do you need? Because not everybody is the exact same. People have different reasons why they are trapped in poverty. People need different support structures to support exactly who they are as individuals. More on that later. The second is that they tell you that individuals often don't get a voice. Like, again, specifically censuses, which are a perfect example of a very helpful way for individuals to self-identify because they tick the box that they want, are possibly the only way that you get a voice, because you get to tick that voice and that box and give it over. The third is that they say, well, in terms of jobs, all corporations are run by white men and racist. First off, we feel like they're being simplistic about governments and jobs. But second, again, we point out that yes, individuals will be awful in some cases on both sides of the house. The difference is that you wouldn't be able to build an affirmative action policy overseen by a government to no thank you and actively employing African Americans to rebuild the imbalance that existed. You only have the negatives of single individual employers still being racist. Finally, they brought us the point of individuals should they be able to identify themselves, and how this is going to get less accurate information. It is technically true, right? They're correct that we're not going to get perfect information when we ask you to tell us yourselves. The information we do get is we know the supports that you actively want. So you prioritise yourself and you tell us what is most important to you. Are you an American who wants to have that recognised, or do you need to be recognised as an African American? That person is best placed to do that. They fill in the form. They just don't know better in opening government. It's not acceptable for them to stay blind to a problem that mostly governments have created. First, why states actively need this. So the reality is that governments aren't inherently racist. There are many instances where, first off, we see quotas actively being supported. No, thank you. We see devolved power. So it is individuals ruling themselves, often in localised areas, to the extent, no, thank you, of devolving, allowing Maori courts within New Zealand to look after themselves, allowing those kind of supports. But the reality is that people, and this is direct response to, we were told that we should just, fix poverty as a thing, as one collective homogenous group.
you can't put poverty into that one simple bracket because people are obviously poor for very different reasons. I am not the exact same as someone else who just has the same budget as me, and it is important that I need different supports. First off, there are probably different ways that I need to support it. So Paul already gave the example of prisons needing to be different to cater specifically to individuals of a minority community who feel more isolated and more excluded within a normal prison system, and so that it is unacceptable to not have that support and not to ask individuals what they need in terms of helping them. But equally, in terms of giving things like schools in specific languages, in terms of allowing people clubs to socialise, there are basic structures that, like, I need as somebody who identifies as a different ethnic group, or having my religion represented in school so that I can actually attend that. When they're colourblind to that, or blind to that ethnicity, they actively lock me out of the state in a way that they don't do to others. This is important first because on opening opposition, it's obviously good to take this affirmative action. But we don't need to make this value judgment. Governments are trying to do it already. All we're telling you is that they can do it better on our side. No thanks. Final point is that you feel more bought in. Again, this is a response to the argument that now you feel like the government is surveying you. It's probably when you are checked constantly on the street for papers that you feel that the government is oppressing you. This is plausibly the only dialogue that happens. The only time you are asked for your opinion. You tick a box and ask the government for what support. The first reason why it doesn't feel oppressive is because you actively see benefits coming out of it. Things like schools opening in a specific language or facilitating to a specific religion so that, for example, Catholics feel comfortable going to those is massively beneficial. This happens all over the world. See, specifically like in the UK and Ireland, but like all over the world, governments have done small things to accommodate. But also, I will take you in a second. The reality is that there's a dialogue that is less confrontational than any others. I'll take a point of information. Who's eager? Second half.
Given that when there's no race information, you don't get the backlash and stereotyping of knowing that there's many blacks in prison in the United States, but you do get the benefit of knowing there's lots of people in prison who need to be helped. Isn't it better to focus on that rather than the former?
First, factually incorrect. You get all of that backlash because of the public polls, because of tabloid, like even without a public poll, just the tabloid writing about African Americans being criminals, you have all of the misinformation. This is the second point about public opinion. Information currently is one of two things. First off, it is often massively inflated or deflated. And the people on the street, when asked how many Muslims are in your country, usually guess 4 times the accurate amount when asked in the UK. Like that's the stereotype that is built up through our own everyday experiences and our own xenophobia, which needs to be tackled and can be tackled. They say like racists will always be angry. They will, but middle ground people are won over to our side when we show them our official looking poll that says, look, here's the actual information, guys. Second point is that it is often inflated by communities. So for example, the Catholic Church massively overestimates how many people it needs, and so gets far too many schools in certain areas in terms of compared to individuals who in themselves in a sense say whether they are a Catholic or not. The reality is that many different factors have to be considered in your life. The difference currently, and here's the problem, people think that money or wealth or education defines how you'll succeed, but they only have their stereotypes to rely on race. It is a factor. I am judged on my race and my ethnicity, and it needs to be documented in a complex way with all of the other ones. A government poll is the only way to do that. Proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, from closing government, we're going to bring you 2 things in extension. Firstly, why this propagates a class structure in the developing world, which is one of the most important actors in this debate. Secondly, how this grossly distorts the formulation of public policy, both in the Western world and in developing nations. On this first issue of extension, we're going to bring you why this propagates a class structure in the developing world. Madam and Mr. Speakers, what we recognise is that class is used as a political tool in parts of the developing world, most relevantly in countries such as Malaysia and India. There, in Malaysia, you have Najib Razak leading his government appealing to ethnic Malay population as his popularity flags due to scandals involving corruption and $800 million missing that's gone out of his bank account. To shore up his position, he's appealing to his ethnic base to secure votes. In India, you see Modi leading his government on the base of nationalism, nationalistic pride, reinforcing the caste system, which he was also responsible for doing when he was governor of Gujarat. Indian and Malaysian governments, therefore, and governments in the developing world, tend to pander towards these minorities. Why is recording of race specifically so pernicious and entrenching racial policy? Because in countries like Malaysia and in India, what we see is that these governments grant entitlements on the basis of class, on the basis of ethnicity, and on the basis of race. By implementing this policy, you remove the government's ability to effectively do the most harmful aspect of racist government policy, which is implementing these entitlements, implementing these benefits. These benefits are, you are more likely to get a job in the public service, you're more likely to go to a privileged school, you're more likely to receive welfare and receive greater amounts of welfare than your other multiracial peers, or peers of different races. Why is that so important? If you remove that box on that government form that allows someone to specify their race, you practically remove the ability for governments to grant those entitlements across the country. What it will mean is that you will need to require every recipient of welfare, every person, to interview and show evidence of their race, a burden which we say is practically impossible for the state to reach. You therefore undermine the government's ability to privilege certain classes above others in the most pernicious of ways. Instead, they'll have to rely only on implicit racism, once they know for sure someone's of one race and once they know for sure someone is of another. That will defeat massive cash handouts to ethnic Malays. That will defeat automatically placing someone on a priority list for a public service job or for government housing. That will not be practically possible if governments are not recording the information. Crucially important. We also think you disincentivise the government's ability to pander to that racial minority and to appeal to that ethnic Malay population if you're Razik, or appeal to certain castes if you're Modi. Why is that? Because even though you can make the pronouncement publicly, thank you, and appeal to that Malay population and hope that they vote for you on that basis, because you aren't giving them these entitlements on a blanket basis, you are undermining the carrot that you're giving them in order to incentivise them to vote for you. Because that's the promise that you lead. That's how you gain popularity. It isn't just on your status as an ethnic Malay, it's on the benefits you can provide to other ethnic Malays that actually reinforce that status. Developing countries are a crucially important actor in this debate, Madam Speaker and Mr. Speakers. That's because, firstly, there's no safety net in countries such as Malaysia if you aren't a part of the privileged caste, and in India. There's a lot less racial harmony, and these racial problems are amplified. That's why they're a much more important actor than countries such as Australia and the US and the UK that the opening half has focused on in this debate. Secondly, why do you grossly distort public policy? Madam and Mr. Speakers, if you come from a racial minority, you're much more likely to face problems with alcoholism, drug use, and crime. That is not because of the fact you are a minority. That is because of the socio-economic systems that you've been placed in, the lack of structure, and the failing of government to provide those services. We agree with our opening half on that, with that analysis. Here's where we argue that the opening half was mistaken in thinking that recording that analysis would work. Because we say that in fixing these problems, it is not to do with someone's racial background, their ethnicity. It's to do with problems such as infrastructure in geographical areas, by providing schools in towns that are predominantly made up of a race, by improving the standards of education, by fighting against stereotypes and discrimination in schools and in institutions. It's by focusing on things such as someone's wealth, such as someone's class and someone's financial status, and I'll take you in a second, and focusing on where they come from, for example, from rural backgrounds. Please.
Your burden is to show why this should never be done. You have given one example of a situation where we need where we need this information in order to discriminate. We actually don't, because we can still rely on their surname, their address, and policemen can still just visibly use racism to discriminate against people, but we do need good information to actually provide the benefits that we talk about. Engage with that.
No. Our burden is not to prove. It's like you will never know someone's race or to prevent someone from ever giving their race voluntarily, right? That's impossible. How could you censor someone from telling someone about their race? This point is about government policy and what governments do to facilitate that, right? Which is what my entire speech has been based on. We also think that you prevent problems from being stereotyped as issues to do with race when race isn't a relevant factor. We think that particularly an example in Australia where alcoholism is seen as an Indigenous problem. If you're an Indigenous person, you're much more likely to have a problem with alcohol. The tying factor of race ignores more the reasons why that person is more likely to be an alcoholic in the first place. The fact that they were neglected from having good hospitals in their area. The fact that they never had access to educational services. Things that weren't independent of their race and were more dependent on geographical location, their class in society, and other things that were just never dealt with if you're simply focusing the lens of government policy purely on race. What did opening opposition tell us about governments doing a lot of good for, in terms of AA policies, etc.? Firstly, AA policies tend not to happen in countries that are the most racist and have the biggest problems with ethnicity. That's because the privileged are empowered in those countries. But secondly, we also say that for a lot of AA policies, you don't need the information, right? There's nothing stopping you under this model providing a scholarship for African American students. Unclear why you need to know the exact percentage of the population that was African American to provide that scholarship or to provide that AA. But thirdly, we also told you, as we alluded to in a point of information, you should be focusing on evidence-based policies such as someone's wealth, income, and education. But fourthly, we think it's much more politically palatable to focus on a group such as the poor that can have the sympathy of the entire population rather than focusing on someone's race. Mr. Speaker, this debate is about what gets the best government policy, particularly in the developing world for the reasons we told you. That's why it's crucial we don't record someone's race or ethnicity.
So I think opening opposition have done a very good job in this debate about pointing out how there are certain groups in society which will face certain historical oppressions, and knowing that is very helpful in terms of directing services. We want to win this debate from closing opposition by providing the biggest impact, actually point out where information is currently collected and how it's used. I want to talk about three big interventions we think are important. Firstly, targeting race-based crime and the states being able to effectively tackle the roots of that race-based crime and knowing the areas where it's most prevalent. Secondly, I'm going to talk about stopping radicalisation in Western democracies. This is very important in a country like France. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about affirmative action and the benefits of that. But before I get into all of that, I'm going to respond to the government bench. So firstly, on closing government, this ethnic politics argument we get. Firstly, look, appealing to ethnic bases still massively occurs on your side of the House. So Modi will still say, please vote for me, please vote for the BJP, and he will appeal to ethnicity saying, look, we will support you, we are going to protect you. And we'll also say that, so that doesn't change much. But also recognise also, politicians have common knowledge that certain areas of, say, a state, for example, are predominantly where the Gujaratis, for example, live. So they will, politicians will still be able to target significant welfare to an area based on this common knowledge that this is just the area where we know that people of that ethnicity live. So we don't really change much on that, and similarly with the Malay issue. But thirdly, we say, look, names are very good indicators of your background. So recognise the Patel community in India. If you are a Patel, you are of that caste, and therefore you can still give benefits to the Patel community because they are called Patels. Recognise the Dalits and the Brahmin caste in India. It's so obvious if you are of that that caste because of your name, because of where you've lived, because of what your dad does, what your occupation is. So that information can all be gleaned anyway. So I'm not really sure closing government have solved any of those ethnic harms. If they have, they're very, very marginal. Also, they say it's really bad when we collect this information about race and we only look at race. Guys, governments aren't stupid. They collect lots of information about your socioeconomic status, about your occupation, about your gender, about all that kind of stuff. So we don't just have to look at race. We can take all of these factors into account and then make a holistic decision about what's the most appropriate intervention for that group based upon all those factors. So that's what we think in response to closing gov. In terms of opening governments bring us the idea that racist governments exist. Yes, that's true. They exist on both sides of the house. I just don't think opening government ever showed us why having this specific data was in any way able to meaningfully increase the extent to which the oppression can happen. So, for example, the social housing example they give us, look, if many black individuals in America start moving into community, it just is the case often white individuals move out because that racism exists in that society, and it's that which is a problem which hurts those communities. Not much the state has done there to create that problem. That's a societal consequence of that racism. They give us an example of refugees and Donald Trump saying, how isn't it so bad we have all these Muslims coming in? We recognise that the United States of America, the people of America, still know there's a refugee crisis in Syria because what's been read in the newspapers. They probably make a meaningful expectation of who these people are. So again, you just haven't changed that on your side of the house in any meaningful way. Thirdly, and finally, they say, we're putting their culture into a box, and that's really harmful. I just don't know what that means in terms of the impact in the real world. Okay, maybe I tick my box and I just get on with my life. I think what's more likely is that the discrimination you face on a daily basis, that's more likely to be the thing which makes you feel disenfranchised. I'm about to explain now how we can better target that discrimination and stop it, which is the most important thing in this debate. So what are extensions? Firstly, targeted interventions to prevent race-based crime. So closing government tell us we need to fight discrimination. Yes, we agree with you, closing government, but the problem is that we've limited capital and resources to target our interventions. So if it's the case that we know, for example, there is crime in this area, there's crime in this area, but we have no records of was it black on white crime, was it white on black crime, what was the prevalence of that crime, what's the nature of that crime? With this information, either governments or B, charities, because charities are a very important actor in this debate, because governments publish this information, and charities then use this information and say, look, okay, so we're SOS Racisme in Paris, for example, and we recognise this is a particular area where there are really high incidences of white on black crime. So we, as SOS Racisme, should go to that area and target our, for example, educational programmes in schools in that area, because that's the place where we can have most impact. If we can target that deep-rooted problem of racism in that area, then we can stop all that crime and much more likely stop that crime. Without this information, this charity might know there is crime happening all over Paris, but they might not know where necessarily the racial crime is most happening, so therefore they can't target their intervention as appropriately. So we think that's the first big impact of this policy, which is simply less racism at the point we can target our intervention. That has a real-world impact associated, which is simply less violence against those groups in the long run, and so on. These are really important things that should be weighed in this round. Secondly, let's talk about radicalisation. Before I do that, I'll take someone. Yeah, go.
Given that, for instance, newspapers report on instances of race-based crime, is that really the most important issue for the government when that's not a thing solved quantitatively, it's a thing solved qualitatively,
no,
as you've said?
The problem is that you might have a story, okay, there was a racial attack in a part of LA, for example, but on your side of the house, charities only have that information to go on. On our side of the house, we get macro-level data across the entirety of a county, across the entirety of a state, saying, look, here, there's actually more of that type of crime happening here, so therefore we better target our intervention there. It's just better information on our side of the house. Let's talk about radicalisation in Western liberal democracies. So recognise that people of a certain ethnic background, unfortunately, often are more, for example, likely to fall into radicalisation and to join Islamism, for example. So if you're a Maghrebian in France, you're more likely to be radicalised. Why? Just because you're more likely to be a Muslim in the first instance, because you're from a background and a culture where that faith is more prominent. So what the problem with that on your side of the house is it's very difficult to know where the highest concentrations of those groups are in an accurate way, and what we can therefore do is recognise that this is an area or a culture particularly vulnerable to radicalisation. So we can then, through charities or through governments, departments, target our interventions again. So it's an extension of the targeted intervention argument I was making, but applying it to a very pressing problem in the world today, which is that of Islamic terrorism. Because opening government were living in the kind of 1960s, we're living in the world today where we're trying to deal with the problems of today, and that is a very primary one, and this is actually where this policy is being used, for example, in countries like France and in the UK. So we want to live in the real world. Finally, let's talk about affirmative action and the benefits thereof. Because opening up talks about this, but we want to talk about the actual impacts of this and why it happens. Because look, God, if you're not allowing, if you're saying the state shouldn't be able to take information about people's backgrounds, I just don't know how you can have these affirmative action policies, contrary to what closing government said, because you're just not taking any information about if they're black, if they're African American, and so on. And so this all stands. So the problem, therefore, is that we think the benefits of such programs, say affirmative action in the United States, you get more role models at the top of society who are from that background. So they are initially in a disadvantaged position. They're probably from a background with less capital because they are victims of slavery, for example, historically. So they have less money to spend on tutoring, on education. They're less likely to get into top universities, top colleges. With our affirmative action policies, which you cannot have on your side of the house, we parachute those people into better colleges. They're more likely to succeed in life, get better jobs, and they become role models in society. That helps younger African Americans to have self-esteem, apply for educational roles themselves where they wouldn't apply before, because that's something that they can do, and so on. And this rectifies injustices which opening government are so rhetorically wanting to care about. We can actually have ways to help those rectify those injustices for those people alive today. We were the team that brought you the biggest impacts in this debate. We talked about how we reduce race-based crime, we reduce radicalisation, and we help on educational benefits. We're very happy to oppose.
The problem with the debate that's happened about government policy and helping certain groups is this. The government can help groups who are affected by things like poverty, things like a lack of education, things like alcohol abuse, things like their health, by looking at poverty, education, alcohol abuse, and their health. It doesn't need to look at that race. And in fact, we think it tinges the policy to look at that race. But more importantly, it tinges the politics to look at that race. And that means that if governments are making decisions and trying to argue to help poor people, when people can look at statistics that say that more Indigenous groups or more black groups are on that welfare, that means that people are less likely to support giving up some of their money to help those people through the taxation and distribution system. So not only did it mean that better policy would be formulated, it meant that policy would actually occur in a world where the government focused on the problems it was trying to solve, the poverty of an Indigenous person, rather than the indigeneity of that Indigenous person. We thought that was what was crucial. Two issues in this debate. Firstly, we'll talk about policy in nations like developing nations, and secondly, we talk about policy in nations where there's this debate about affirmative action. These tend to be the most wealthy nations in the world. Firstly, on developing nations. We thought these were the most important for a few reasons. The first was simply that there was less welfare and safety nets in these nations because they tended to have less wealth, therefore they tended to have less ability to provide those. That was just a fact. But secondly, there was less capital for poor people. As a result, there was less capital generally in those nations. So there was less capital for those minorities, political capital, but also less media access for those minorities in these nations when they tended to have less media generally, less capital generally, less ability to have their voice heard on that basis. So that's why these groups were the most important in this society. But we were told that that's just, you're trying to apply a blanket rule when really we should just say, countries like Malaysia, countries like India shouldn't be able to do this. But the answer to that is, because these are the most important nations, even if it were true that it was good to have this data in wealthy nations, given the most important ones, it's true that we shouldn't have it. We would still apply our blanket rule rather than not apply our blanket rule. But more importantly, as I'll get to in the second issue, we thought that in nations with wealthy governments, it was still a good thing as well. What was really crucial about what Leo told you was that this entrenched political power, particularly, because in countries like Malaysia, you could appeal to a base when you said we are giving this money to ethnic Malays only. And the only way you could have a policy like that, the only way you could credibly promise to do that, regardless of whether you could sneakily do it with geographical areas, that's not important, because it's about what you can politically credibly promise when it comes to voting and what people decide. The only way you could credibly do that is if you had a system that recorded race, a system that took that into account, because things like bank transfers can't be done based on implicit racism. Things like payments to people can't be done on the basis of what they look like. That's because it's a government policy system rather than an individual decision-making system. As for things like names, and you're still able to be racist, we thought that at the point at which you couldn't have a policy based on race, because you couldn't identify those races in all cases, therefore you couldn't have the policy at all. We think that wasn't that important. But secondly, people were able to change their names or things like that. We didn't think that was a key sort of failure on our side of the house. You simply couldn't have a policy saying we're giving welfare to this particular group. And yes, you could have a policy saying we're giving welfare to people with the last name Patel, but we thought that would be much less politically palatable, much less likely to happen, given all of the other people in that group might resent the Patels as a result. On policy in nations then with wealthy governments, the ones that Western liberal democracies that tend to have more affirmative action, those sorts of things. Well, firstly, as our opening pointed out, we thought there wasn't much affirmative action occurring in most places anyway, on a government level. We gave you a couple of reasons for that. We told you that was because that politically, minorities tended not to have as much political power to give that, and the wealthy classes tended not to want to give up their money for those people. But what we've heard all down the line from the government is that we only lose the good AA but governments can still do the bad things. They still look at people and assess their race on that basis. We've got a few issues with that. Okay, opening.
So we explained that there are specific problems, like you need schools that facilitate religion, you need affirmative action to know what quotas you should be letting into your parliament and how many people you should be letting into college. We can do that only on our side when we get accurate information and information from that person's perspective. The reason why you can still oppress people with other information is I don't need to know what they think, I can just look at them and judge them.
Yes, so as I was responding to exactly that thing, let's look at the individual level of that first. So the idea of the police officer looking at a person and saying, this looks like an African American, and treating them differently as a result. We thought maybe that would still happen, but that happened on either side of the house. It wasn't something that could necessarily be solved. We thought it was better when the person who saw that police report, no thank you, or the judge who was handling that on the papers without seeing that person, was able to tell what race they were because it was recorded. When people in the background were able to tell that those crimes tended to occur more in that racial group, then that police officer looking at that person wearing a hood might think they're more likely to be committing that crime and might be more likely to shoot that person as a result. We thought that was the problem that you had when those statistics existed for police officers in that world. Yes, they could still have implicit prejudices, but we still thought we had a better result on that individual level, even if it wasn't as perfect as like our side would like it to be in our best case. But why is the bureaucratic and policy side more important? We thought that's where the big damage was done to groups. We thought that's where a class was entrenched on a level, an endemic level that continued to exist in society on the basis of wealth, on the basis of taxation systems, on those sorts of things. That's why the bureaucratic and policy level was more important as to helping these people. Who got better AA? We thought, given that most of these places we're talking about here are democracies, racial groups could still push and vote for policy that helped them. Even if it didn't help them on the basis of their race, it would still help them on the basis of the problems that they faced in society. So we still got that push for that positive affirmative action. It just wasn't in the nature of affirmative action. It was in the nature of helping people fix problems in society that affect people rather than that affect a race per se. But you all lost the backlash of racists. So when a government said we're going to give more money to poor people, that was much more convincing than them targeting something at poor minorities, because the majority were less likely to accept that. You told us it wasn't about racists, it was about what the middle ground would be convinced of. We thought the middle ground would be convinced of things without understanding the causes, like there's more alcohol abuse, like people of certain races tend to be less employed. We thought that was harmful to perpetuate in society. It caused more discrimination in the first place, because people just assumed the causes of that, because you could never prove the causes of it in the way by looking at historical disadvantage for that middle ground. It was more politically possible to achieve change. As for things like opinion polls, and racists could still do things. Racists weren't going to conduct opinion polls. That didn't make any sense. Only groups that had an interest in helping people would try and highlight their plight. We never thought you'd have racists going around trying to highlight how bad African Americans are by polling them. We thought the African Americans would probably not answer the phone if you did that. As for things like race-based crime and radicalisation, we thought you made it so much worse when you just put more police into areas with more black people. We thought it was so much worse when the police targeted Muslims because they were Muslim rather than because they were talking to IS on Twitter. We thought what was more important was to target people based on true evidence, and the rhetoric that created when you targeted people based on race made that policy so much worse for all the analysis we've already given. We propose.
We absolutely cannot stand in this round to support the de facto racism that side government bench has just pretty much spouted the entire time. I don't say that lightly, I really do mean this. De facto racism in the United States is when you don't take into account the idea that African Americans do face like intensely racist interactions with white people on a daily basis, right? We think that those kind of interactions manifest themselves in people less likely to get jobs, less likely to feel safe on the street, right? And actually people do act violently against these people, right? Like African Americans are like still attacked and attacked by police officers as well, right? So we think that there's like a very real harm in terms of like ignoring this fact, right? If we say we're not going to look at the instances in which this kind of crime occurs, like against these individuals, we think that you just sweep the kind of like inequality that exists in society under the rug, right? If society is unequal, ignoring the differences between people does not mean that creates an equal society, right? You ignore the problem, the inequality, and by doing that you are unable to address it. This is the kind of policy that side government is really is just talking about, and we think that that's really unfortunate. We think on their side of the house, the comparative, if you employ this, right, you're not getting anything like the stereotypes are not being challenged in terms of people associating alcohol problems with indigenous people, associating poor people with being Hispanic, associating black people with being violent, right? We think those stereotypes still continue, right? And now, unfortunately, all of the inequality and unfortunately, policing and stuff that affect these people are not being able to be addressed by the government. Okay, we think that from closing opposition, we actually tell you why in society this is going to create larger problems, right? In terms of radicalization, in terms of the idea that it does nothing to address the kind of white flight that we see in areas where people just see a black family move in, more and more black families move in, say they're racist, and then they leave, right? What does this actually mean, right? Okay, no one on side government actually interacted with this either, but basically what this means is that this tends to actually ghettoize these areas, right? This occurs on their side of the house, and it can occur on both sides of the house. On our side of the house, we allow for a mechanism in which the government can say, look, wait, all of these people are of one race, they're less likely to have better schooling, because in reality, most minorities don't have the same economic, financial stability that a lot of the white majority do have, right? On whole, right? This means that there's worse schooling in this area. As Joe was talking about, this leads to less opportunities for these people. They are unlikely to be able to be role models in society. This means it's a perpetual cycle of these people unable to gain access to the upper echelons of society. We think that is especially problematic. Okay. So going into a little bit more of specific rebuttal from closing government, and then summarizing kind of why on the comparative on all of these issues, especially in terms of radicalization, which, as Joe pointed out, is a pressing issue in a lot of these areas, especially where in France we see a lot of refugees coming in, they're being isolated in certain areas. We think that, especially on policing, which is a significant issue in the United States, we win on these impacts. Okay, going on to the CG case, right? Again, I already talked about it. People are still going to see these people. They're still going to have stereotypes. Your side of the house does not allow the government to step in and say, look, when you stop hiring black people, we think that that's wrong. We think that that's racist, right? On your side of the house, the government cannot say that this is a racist company, this is a racist institution, and you are discriminating illegally. On our side of the house, we're allowed to do that. People on their side of the house cannot make a complaint. If I, as a Mexican, can't get a job in the United States, and I think it's because I'm being racially discriminated against, I can't make a complaint to the government anymore because they don't care about that fact, that part of my identity. Okay. The second part is they don't. Sorry. And in terms of the ethnic thing as well, the problem is that you still have access to this information. We just think that you don't solve any of the problems in terms of this pandering in India and Malaysia. Why do we win on that comparative though, right? So the last speaker did kind of bring up this idea that, we just kind of say we help people more on their side and by using this information, and on this side they're saying we don't help them, right? Okay, we think that in society, and these people are still going to pander regardless, right? So side government doesn't gain any of the benefits that they're talking about. Largely, you're still able to do this based on the naming. Yes, you might have more of a bureaucratic issue, but you can still say, I support a certain group in society, vote for me, and I'm going to be able to target you somehow, right? We just think that happens because of there's larger issues of knowledge, and based on the knowledge, certain races live in certain areas, or they're able to access different things. We think that information is out there. What is the benefit that we have on our side of the house, right? Like that probably can still, that yes, will still happen on our side of the house. But we do not prevent a government from proactively trying to address these problems. That's what we gain uniquely on our side of the house. We think that on their side of the house, they have to address the enormous harm that you prevent governments from trying to right the wrongs of the past, and that's something that they are unable to do. I'll take opening.
To solve political problems, you need political will and care. Racist white government and the apathetic public already know from the media there are racial minorities and racial problems. Why would these numbers make them actually want to help?
Okay, so the issue is, like, as Joe said, even if there's not a lot of political will in terms of the general public, there are still charities that are able to access this information. You don't have that on your side of the house. We think that that is a harm in of itself, right? If you look at human rights organizations and charities, which do actually like target these groups and individuals in order to make their lives better, we think that that is an enormous harm you don't get on your side of the house. But additionally, we say that like the justice departments of a lot of these countries do prosecute these cases, do look into the companies that do get complaints for racial discrimination. We think that the Justice Department having those statistics, saying that there are certain areas that like are ghettoized and face a lot of the violent crime from police against their own citizens, when you see that at the Justice Department level, you're more likely to prosecute it, and justice departments don't necessarily are not tied to the political will as much as the legislature. That's why we get those benefits on our side of the house. Okay, really quickly, why we think we really brought the impacts in this round. Okay, look, policing, right? They're saying like, oh, well, they're just going to shoot them anyway because they're going to see they're black, right? Well, the problem is that yes, that's going to still happen probably on both sides of the house. You just have no way to fix it on your side of the house, right? We think that that is a horrible harm. You leave these people basically in the dark with no access to the kind of benefits that you can have with prosecuting these cases and looking at the kind of entrenched racism that exists in many countries today, right? We think that that is the benefit we have. But in terms of like radicalization, right? These people actually get ghettoized outside of the cities. What happens? They feel isolated from the rest of society. If a country can see that happening, see that like these areas are getting progressively more isolated from society, more likely to be radicalized, because that's just a fact. When you're isolated from the rest of the country and you're just surrounded by people who agree that they're not being treated as well as the majority white population, they are more radicalization is more likely to occur in these areas. We think it's in the government's best interest to be able to go in, target those with de-radicalization programs. They're not just going to be like policing people. They're not going to like send people to like go shoot these people, like as the closing government kind of like implied. You do this responsibly, but without the kind of information that we are standing for on our side of the house, we are unable to do that. You're going to see more radicalization. It's for these reasons we strongly oppose. Thank you.